Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next of our webinars on new books on aviation. So this time we're having a book which was co-edited by myself, but also Hans-Martin Niemeyer, Jürgen Müller, and Eric Pelz. Now, I don't think Jürgen is coming, but Hans-Martin is here. Okay, so 2 weeks ago, we discussed the book on airport economics, which Cathal and Hans-Martin and I did. And that was a book about the overall scope of airport economics. So this time, we've got a particular key aspect of airport economics, namely airport regulation. And we did have a book, a GARS book, way back in 2004 on airport regulation. But for various reasons, we thought it might be a good idea to have a new book. And so that is it. Now, this is an edited book with about, I think, 19 chapters with various specialists in their areas. Now, there are just to give you an idea of what it's covering, it's roughly the first part is what we call theory, but it's not really theory. It's all sorts of things. So we look firstly at issues to do with how strong airport competition is and the need or otherwise for regulation. And then we look at transaction cost aspects. We look at European hubs. We look at cost-based regulation, airport privatization, optimizing airports in regulated airports, and so on. So that's a bit of a ragbag of topics. Then in the second part, we look at benchmarking. And there are several chapters in that. And in fact, what we'll be doing this afternoon, evening, morning, or whatever, is we'll be looking in some detail at benchmarking. And we've got 3 people who'll have a look at it. We'll start with Cathal, looking at the practicalities of benchmarking in regulation. Then we will move over to Nicole, who will look at issues of efficiency measurement and the use of in benchmarking. And then to finish off with, we have a brief talk by Darryl Biggar, who also has a chapter looking at transaction cost aspects. And so that's the second section. And then thirdly, we've got a series of country studies, beginning with the United Kingdom, the French, the Germans, the Dutch, and then we have a general chapter on a range of different countries in Europe. And finally, we have a chapter on Latin America and regulation there. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll give each of our panelists 10 minutes or so to set out their ideas, and then I might ask a question or two, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So, Cathal, would you like to start off?
I'll do that. I'll just share a screen. So I'm looking at some of the practicalities here of airport benchmarking. I want to start by saying that I'm describing the early period of price regulation in Dublin, which in fact was 20 years ago. So although I think the lessons are still general, the criticisms of the airport operator, which I'll be making, cannot validly be made against the Dublin Airport Authority today. Things have changed a lot. In particular, there's been a big maturation, I would say, in airport price regulation. There's more professional engagement from airlines and from the airport, and some of the problems I'm going to mention, therefore, are less. I have 5 slides. I'll introduce each one and then show it to you. The first one concerns what you might politely call regulatory gaming or simple dishonesty. So we'll see a chart with a particular financial metric. The details don't matter for Dublin Airport. The upper line is the audited number that became available 12 months later. The blue line is the number provided to the regulator. So if you look at where the blue line starts, it shows a ratio of 10% and falling, when the true number was 20%, but coming down as well. So one impact that had on the regulatory office was just to make us extremely skeptical about all of the numbers we subsequently received, leaning towards disbelieving any kind of bad news story we were presented with. So I don't think it worked to the operator's favor in the end. Moving on, there's another slide now comparing microeconomics textbook picture of price regulation and something closer to the reality. So on the left here, we see a typical demand-supply story from a textbook, and you see the job of the regulator is very modest, very simple. You just move the price from C to F, and all is well. Lots of consumer surplus, everybody's happy. Or you're faced with the numbers, the very limited data points on the right. 3 price quantity pairs, the airport price at A as it stands, and the traffic numbers. A story from the airport that without an immediate and large price increase, bankruptcy looms. And a story from the airlines that the price could be a lot lower and far more passengers could be processed. So one thing we'll see in a couple of the slides is no amount of benchmarking saves the regulatory office from a job of making a judgment in the end, a judgment about at what level to set the ingredients that feed into the pricing decision in the end. There may be a lot of information, there may be very little. In either case, you're going to be making a judgment as to what's required. This is an example of a particular benchmarking exercise carried out for Dublin, using as comparators the airport served by the 2 main airlines, Ryanair and Aer Lingus. You'll see the enormous variation in the operating cost per passenger, a kind of a bewildering range there, really. And the horizontal lines show the numbers as they were presented by the stakeholders to the airport, to the regulator's office. So a high horizontal line from the airport, a low horizontal line from Ryanair. This is what I mean about regulatory judgment. One other lesson is that since both sides of the industry will be presenting their own benchmarking report, showing flatly contradictory stories, there's an obligation, a requirement for the regulatory office to conduct its own benchmark and to gather information that it can have a certain amount of confidence in itself. You can also look at trends. You can also look at trends, obviously, not simply in the airport industry. You can look at a related industry like airlines and see what's happening to unit costs. You can look at trends in, say, other government-owned companies. Dublin Airport is government-owned. The interesting feature of the right-hand chart here, I would say, is that there is an unnamed company, government-owned company, where the costs are shooting up, all out of line with the trends in the other sectors, the other companies. It may interest you to know that the company in question is the Irish air navigation services provider, then called the Irish Aviation Authority, now called NavAir Ireland. And you can see the cost trends there as testimony to something we know well, which is the rigorous and very effective price regulation in the air traffic control sector. And then finally, I'll just look at another trade-off that arises. And the trade-off here is between the quantity and quality of the information generated and exchanged between stakeholders. and the risk of completely swamping the capacity of smaller stakeholders to consume that information. So on one occasion, Dublin Airport provided the regulator's office, or sent the regulator's office, a single submission running to 800 pages. Now, we had no choice but to read that closely, but of course, the airlines weren't really going to be in a position to do that. And even our own decisions, our own documentation was getting very lengthy very quickly. And we had to take a decision that we would actually have a target number of pages that we would aim to limit a particular documentation to, for just the same reason that at least we wanted the people interested in the reports to be able to look at them, be able to consume them. There's a technical aspect to the same quality quantity story, which is that the more sophisticated measurements will be a challenge for stakeholders to understand or to even accept. I think the position is a bit better now because I think Nicole is enjoying this. Because I think the airlines are more likely now, or the consumer side of the industry is more likely now to employ consultants, partly to interpret other parties' submissions and consultancy reports and the like. But without that, they would really struggle to understand what's being presented. So it's not quite as easy as it's sometimes taken to be, but I think as it progresses, the parties adapt and engage in a more professional manner. And that's what my chapter talks about.
Well, thanks very much, Cathal. Perhaps I should have introduced you. I won't say anything much, but just simply to say that you are currently at the DCU, which is the Dublin City University, and have been for a number of years. But before that, Cathal was the CEO, or whatever you like to call it, of the what was it, the Commission on Aviation Regulation. I think I've got that. So that's where Cathal has got quite a few ideas and information from. Okay, then I'd just like to move on to Nicole. And Nicole is she's at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and she is currently Dean of Business. She is a very busy person. So over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Cathal. That did indeed make me smile. I have one thing to say. I am based in Israel. If there is a siren, I will need to leave, and I apologize for that in advance. Yeah. And if anyone wants to talk to me about the actual situation, I will stay online. So I will talk about the chapter that I wrote with Shravan Kumar. I don't know if Shravan is here. No. Shravan was a PhD student at Dresden and with Hans Martin at Bremen. And he did a lot of work on benchmarking both ports and airports. And the chapter that we wrote together for this book first describes sort of the three main methods for assessing efficiency: cost efficiency, productive efficiency, and sometimes technical efficiency. There are three main methods. There's the classic TFP, total factor productivity, where you need to know the quantities and the prices and a whole lot of information that is not always available, but when it is, can be used to look at what happens over time, for example, at the airports. And then there's two alternative methods that don't require quite as much information. The first one being data envelopment analysis, which is a mathematical method based on optimization, and stochastic frontier analysis, which is a statistical method based on regression. So that's what keeps the consultants busy, as Cathal described just now, because each of these methods have their own advantages and disadvantages. And so they can also lead to slightly different results, which means that you can sort of theoretically anyway, pick what you want to make you look better. And no, unfortunately, there is not like the one ultimate method for benchmarking anything, and that would, of course, include airports. What we then go on, and I guess the heart of this chapter is about, is we actually have a review of 12 academic empirical papers that have used one form or more of the benchmarking approaches to try and understand whether, you know, regulation does indeed help to improve the efficiency of the airports or the airport systems. And I would say that at a very simplified basis, 7 argue that regulation is indeed helpful and encourages efficiency. 2 appear to argue that it has no impact. And there are 3 that argue that it is a bad thing. We should not be regulating airports because it simply engenders inefficiency. So I would first of all state that the majority do argue that regulation is necessary. It's necessary when there is insufficient competition. And one can discuss what we mean by competing airports. So you could think of large cities with multiple airports as potentially competing with each other to attract passengers, to attract airlines. You could also talk about the hubs across Europe sort of competing with each other to serve passengers going from Asia and the Middle East to, say, North America. So there's a long debate about whether competition could in fact replace the need for regulation. I think that several papers in that group of 7 do show that this is a possibility. And then I would go on to, well, there are 3 papers that appear to argue otherwise. I would say that those 3 papers compare airports in the United States, Europe, and Australia. And they argue that the airports in the United States are not regulated, and or they define them as unregulated in their analysis. And I would say that this is not reasonable argument. And the reason why I would disagree with that statement is that the vast majority of them, they are not privatized. So the ownership form is like a public authority or a local government, but they are definitely defined as non-profits. They do have agreements with airlines, whether residual or compensatory. And very often in the United States, at least at the big airports, the airlines own one or more of the terminals. And so it becomes extremely difficult to really compare fairly the American airports with the rest of the world. So when you do benchmarking, you do need to be careful that the data that you have ensures that they are comparable. I see that in another chapter that Ian Kincaid wrote in this book together with Mike Trethaway, and they're arguing that one of the other major issues with benchmarking is you must consider also the fixed costs of an airport. Variable factor productivity, for example, is insufficient method for actually comparing airports. When you think about it, these are very large, expensive pieces of infrastructure, and one could easily argue that that argument is true. But of course, it's very hard to compare across airports. It's very hard to assess the real fixed costs of this infrastructure. You will see a whole lot of examples in this chapter with Shravan that suggest ways for doing it. There are proxies. I'm not saying that there's a perfect solution, but there are potential solutions. So the bottom line of this chapter essentially is arguing that when you look at whether efficiency is useful, whether it has been encouraged by different types of regulation, you cannot look at it independently. It's not just these 2 elements. You need to also consider whether the airports are in fact in a competitive environment. What is their ownership form? Because you can find everything across the globe from purely private to purely public airports. And So without looking at all of that combined, you could possibly bias your results. The second point would be that if there is sufficient competition, then potentially regulation is really a waste of money and time and effort. And so maybe it could be ignored. Third one is in terms of ownership form, what appears to come out from these analysis is that you're better off with fully public or fully private airports. The mixed ownership form tends to make the manager's position very difficult. It's hard to understand what they're actually trying to achieve. And it's clearly not efficiency, as can be shown across Europe where there are these mixed ownership forms. My final comment, so I've managed to stay within my 10 minutes, is data. So if the Europeans, for example, really wanted to know whether regulation works and what type of regulation works better, because it does depend on whether this is a major hub airport or some tiny spoke in the middle of nowhere, they should be collecting this data at the European Union level. And hence Martin and Peter and a whole group of people at the European Aviation Conference did try to talk to the European Union authorities on this matter. It's incredibly important because different countries use different reporting rules. And the classic example is that in the UK, runways are depreciated over 20 years, and in France over 100. So that obviously would impact any analysis you try to do. And the European Union could set rules in order to collect that information in order to provide the kind of benchmarking that would help to encourage greater cost efficiency, technical efficiency, and so on. But they so far seem to choose not to, which is a shame.
Good. Well, thanks very much. So our third speaker is Darryl Biggar. Now, Darryl has been for the last few years at the Competition Commission, the ACCC in Australia, where I think he was, were you chief economist or something like that? At any rate, a sort of general role in economic advice. He's now left that institution about a year ago, and he has some sort of connection with Monash University, which is also where I have some sort of connection, but neither of us have quite worked out exactly what our connection is. So, at any rate, Darryl, you pass over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening for everyone. And it's my pleasure to be with you. I'm coming to you from Bali, which is my first time in Bali, but my wife is attending a conference here, so it was my excuse to come. As Peter has said, I was for 20 years a senior economist at the ACCC, involved in all aspects of regulation. The ACCC is Australia's leading federal regulator, and we had responsibility across a number of regulated infrastructure sectors. So regulatory questions was the sort of thing I was dealing with on a regular basis. I am going to be giving a slightly skeptical position approach to the question of the role of benchmarking. I'm not going to be asking the question whether we should regulate airports. I'm not asking the questions how we should regulate airports. I'm merely asking the question, what role does benchmarking have in regulation in general and in airports in particular? So I'm going to share my screen so that I do have some slides. So I will try to do my best to stick to the time. Let's see how to advance the slides. Okay, I will go relatively quickly over the introductory slides. I know there's probably more material than you might be able to see here. First of all, benchmarking means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think it's important that we define it. If you just Google benchmarking, you get a lot of different strange ideas. But really, for regulatory purposes, what we're talking about is comparing the efficiency performance of regulated firms, which means airports in this case. And we would use that. Maybe we'd use that for providing managerial incentives. Maybe we would use that for assessing the impact of privatization, say. But first and foremost, regulators use that for setting regulatory revenues and incentives. Benchmarking in principle can play a role in the regulatory process. But the problem is, as soon as you start thinking about it, how do you go about comparing the efficiency performance of airports? Well, immediately, the question that you come up against is the fact, well, airports are different. The quality, quantity, and the range of services they provide, both aeronautical services and non-aeronautical services, is vastly different across different airports, as well as the prices they pay for imports, as well as, of course, the environmental factors that they face, the weather and so on. So we need to somehow control for these differences if we're going to say that airport A is more efficient than airport B. As you probably know, it's quite common to find people publishing reports of simple comparisons, such as airport movements per employee. I think, didn't Cathal put up a minute ago, OPEX per employee or per passenger or something like that. The trouble is that all such simple measures are open to criticism, that they don't take into account the differences across airports, and we can certainly talk about that. So to do benchmarking properly, essentially it comes down to identifying the cost function that the airport faces. The cost function meaning, given the set of outputs that we want the airport to produce, given the prices for all the inputs that it faces, given the other operating environment factors, what would be the cost of an efficient airport? What would be the cost of an efficient airport? So in order to do benchmarking properly, for efficiency benchmarking that is, we have to be able to say that any difference between this estimated cost that we're estimating through this cost function and what we observe, the actual cost of the firm, is due to management controllable effort or efficiency. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're looking for a cost function for airports. But there are very good reasons why we might think that doing so is difficult / impossible. And I've listed 3 of them here, and that's what the rest of my few slides are going to deal with. The first is the issue of handling capital costs. We've already seen a little bit of that. Cathal and Nicole have talked about that a little bit. I'll talk about that in a slide or two. There are data and modeling limitations, which we'll also talk about in a moment. And there are questions about actually using the resulting information in the regulatory process, which we'll come to in just a moment. First of all, let's talk about the problem of handling capital costs. As has already been said, and it's completely obvious, airports require very substantial sunk investment in long-lived assets. But typically, when we're regulating and we want to compare the performance of firms, we want to compare the performance on periods of time much, much shorter than the life of the assets. Which, as Nicole said, might be 20 years in the case of England, might be 100 years in the case of France. But we're typically, when we're comparing the performance, we want to know, how is Airport A performing in this year compared to Airport B? The trouble is that any allocation of the sunk costs of the proportion of the sunk investment costs is inherently an arbitrary question. It's inherently ambiguous. So there is no right way to do that. If you look at what practitioners do when they try to do benchmarking, sometimes they will try to measure capital costs, but all such decisions are arbitrary. So in practice, in regulatory benchmarking that occurs, typically we abandon the attempts to measure capital costs at all, and we just benchmark OPEX. And Cathal gave an example earlier. But of course, that raises the obvious problem. Well, hang on a minute. To the extent there's any OPEX CAPEX substitution ability, then obviously we can't compare on the basis of OPEX alone. An airport might appear more efficient on the basis of OPEX, but would be less efficient overall if it had a high level of CAPEX and so on. So in addition, there's the one more problem, which we could come back to if you like, which is that in the presence of sunk investments, history matters. Two airports could have identical levels of efficiency, but different costs as a result of the fact that they had different historic build histories. So that was problem number one. Problem number two comes down to the question of how we do this modeling. So when you do the modeling, this creation of the cost function, you have to specify the outputs that you're going to measure. You have to specify the inputs and these operating environment factors. You have to also assume a shape for the cost function, which we often do with parameters. And then you have to decide on a statistical, parametric or non-parametric technique. We've already heard the mentioned ordinary least squares, DEA, stochastic frontier analysis. But each one of those steps creates its own problems in the benchmarking. Just think about the problem of what it would take to specify the output of an airport. If you had to go to an engineer and say, build me an airport, or quote me how much it's going to cost to build this airport. And the engineer says to you, okay, well, I need certain information. I need to know how much, how many planes, what size of planes, the number of movements, the quality of the assets, the range of aeronautical services, the type of traffic, the type of infrastructure, the amenities, the retail and non-aeronautical services, connectivity. All of those things would need to be provided for you to get a cost of the airport. Of course, you'd also need to know the local cost of construction, wage rates, labor conditions, regulatory conditions, weather conditions, and so on. So if you would need all that information, then to cost an airport, then we can't expect to be able to do benchmarking with less than that. But benchmarking tends to use a very small number of variables, usually a handful. Usually from a relatively small number of companies over a relatively small number of years. So as a result, this is due to data limitations. As a result, the estimated cost function that we estimate through the benchmarking process can differ from some sort of true abstract cost. That's even putting aside the capital cost problem we talked about earlier, because of the issues of, well, we've chosen a limited range of variables, we've aggregated variables, we haven't perhaps got all the variables, we don't know what the shape of the cost function is, we chose parameters or we guessed parameters, we don't know. So the problem is that we can't distinguish when we get the results of our DEA or our SFA or our ordinary least squares. We can't say whether the outcome that results is a result of true inefficiency differences or just differences in the modeling process. We can't disentangle the effects of the methodology from the actual managerial effort. That's a big problem. There's one last problem, I won't dwell on it. Oh, this slide just says, can we overcome these problems? Maybe we should just increase the size of the data set, have more firms. The trouble is, if you go to more airports, then they have more differences between them, which need to be controlled for in the estimation process. Doesn't necessarily make things better, could make things worse. Some regulators carry out robustness checks or sensitivity tests by running the same doing productivity using different methodologies, FFA, DEA, and so on. But they use the same data, the same input variables, and so on, the same output variables. And so that's not a adequate test of the reliability of the results. So the last point I wanted to make was just, well, let's suppose you did one of these performance comparisons, efficiency benchmarking, and you came up with a ranking of the airports in your sample. Suppose you had 10 airports, you could rank them from the most efficient to the least efficient according to the output of the benchmarking process, which I've already said we can't rely on necessarily. But then you had to ask the question, well, how much revenue should I give to the firm I regulate? Should I give it on the basis of the most efficient firm in the sample, the least efficient firm in the sample, the average firm in the sample? The problem is that it's not possible to make that judgment until you know something about the errors in the process, and that's not information that the regulator has. So we don't know whether setting the revenue equals, certainly not the most efficient firm, that's likely to be the most biased, but even the least efficient firm is could still be a underestimate. We can come back to these ideas. I won't dwell on this slide because I think that I have only gone over by 1 minute or so. Here are the conclusions. I think there are serious methodological and theoretical reasons why we need to treat benchmarking with caution. And in my experience from working in the regulator, the practitioners, if you like, the consultants that are paid to do this tend to build it up and overpromise what's possible. And I think that there should be a code of conduct for regulatory benchmarking practitioners, and they should be required to spell out the limitations of what they're doing. I will stop there. I hope I've been suitably provocative to stimulate a few questions. Thanks for listening.
Is that right? Good. Okay then, well, thanks very much for that. Now, do the two other speakers have any particular comments on what Darryl has just said, or should we move on to other issues? I think Nicole would like to have a...
No, Cathal first. He put his hand up.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Well, I must digest that when I have more time to digest it more fully. I would make a couple of points. There's no doubt at all that regulatory estimates of efficiency are approximate. That's for sure. The question I would say is, do you judge the degree of market power in the industry to be sufficient to justify an exercise of this kind? Different people will have different views about that. I think the criticisms made there, which are not by no means unreasonable, are ones that would apply to all sectors. So effectively, you would be saying, I think, that the idea of price regulation or benchmarking in support of price regulation across the entire economy is really not possible at all. Now, two other more detailed comments. An important question is whether all of the errors itemized are cumulative or work in different directions. If some tend to produce an upward bias and others a lower bias, then the net position is not going to be quite as far adrift as if they were all working in the one direction. And then finally, regarding capital costs and the like, the regulatory approaches that I'm familiar with involve setting an allowance for the airport for a period ahead. So you are looking very specifically at operating costs as one element of that allowance. You're trying to decide how many 100 million euros per annum to provide to an airport operator in respect of its operating costs. And you certainly are looking at efficiency. I mean, that's what the exercise involves. But it is, I think, certainly conceptually a bit distinct from other elements of the cost base, or at least that's how it seems to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole, did you have something to say?
So I would like to say that in the private sector, benchmarking is happening all the time for all CEOs of any leading firms are doing this in order to learn about their processes and figure out how to improve. What did the other guy do? In terms of airports that have substantial market power, I could take my local airport, Tel Aviv. It doesn't have a whole lot of competition around it. Therefore, this style of exercise is incredibly important. The fact that it isn't simple and the fact that it requires a very careful analysis is obvious. In fact, in this group here is someone from my Civil Aviation Authority, apparently. We definitely should be doing this. We don't. And that's a mistake because there is a lot of, for example, I guess, regulatory capture. So the Ministry of Transport thinks it's there to help out its producers. And no one is looking out for the consumers in that story. So whilst it may not be perfect, and whilst we do have to use proxies, such as the amount of slots that an airport is permitted, because that really does restrict its capability of serving the market. These are proxies, you can take them into account in your models, and you can get reasonable results. Not perfect, they're not precise, they are approximate, and they are definitely better than nothing at all, in my opinion.
Can I respond to that, Peter?
Yes, go on. Yeah, go on.
Okay, I'll try to be quick, because I'd like to get some questions from the others. Look, great comments, great points. I think the one thing that stands out in my response is that in my head, I don't link benchmarking with regulation. Benchmarking is a tool which you may or may not use in regulation. The question whether or not airports need regulation, I think, is a completely different question. In my view, there are many airports in Australia where I live which absolutely have substantial market power and absolutely should be regulated. But regulation is not benchmarking. Benchmarking is not regulation. Benchmarking might be one input into regulation, but the regulatory framework, as part of the whole regulatory process, the regulator should be designing a framework in which the regulated firm has incentives to become efficient, and benchmarking can play a role in that, but you don't have to use a benchmarking at all to achieve that. Another thing that has been said is that benchmarking is approximately right. The question I have, how do we know? How do we know? How do we have any idea that it's giving us the right answer? I'd be interested to know the answer to that. Look, yeah, I'll stop there. I'll stop there because otherwise we'll run out of time if I keep going. So.
Okay,
thanks.
Thanks. I'll ask Konstantinos again. Could you unmute and answer ask your question?
Hello. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the interesting presentations. I just want to raise a couple of issues, and I don't know if you have looked at them. One is the issue of what is the effect of the way that an airport has been financed on this, let's say, on the regulation and the benchmarking exercise. So we know that there are airports that they have been developed through public investments only. There are airports that they have been developed through public-private partnerships under different schemes. So it looks like that this might be one of the factors that is affecting the way that charges are imposed to users. And I don't know if anyone in the group has looked at that. And the other question that I have relates, I mean, I completely agree that there is this huge, let's say, diversion in terms of the context within which different airports operate and the way that they have been developed. And in order to be able to have a kind of a meaningful benchmarking exercise, you need to be able to generate homogeneous, at least to some extent, clusters of airports within which the benchmarking exercise might be more meaningful, to be able to compare things that, I mean, to compare airports that they have just about the same, let's say, operating requirements and the same market requirements. So in that respect, is there any thinking about what should be, let's say, the parameters that one should use in order to develop and determine these homogeneous clusters of airports that can be compared in a more meaningful way?
Good. Is any of the panel likely to comment on that? I mean, it's
okay.
difficult question.
Well,
so.
I'm willing to have a go. Those are tough questions. Thank you, Konstantinos. what I think is that, okay, so now it sounds terrible, but I do actually have a paper that looks at clustering and how you can, in fact, try to benchmark very carefully comparable airports. So you can use statistics to do that, or you could use common sense to define their references. I know, for example, that in Dublin, they tried to set up a real benchmarking kind of Schleifer style yardstick competition, but the main disagreement was about who were the real reference. So this is clearly a tough question to answer, but I do think that there are answers in the literature, and they need to be applied carefully. And Darryl kind of asked the question too, that you can produce confidence intervals, you don't just have to have a point estimate of efficiency. And that gives you an approximate value, which is probably more reasonable. It is done in many industries, not only, of course, in the airports. It's done in the energy industry today, and much regulation across Europe is actually based either on DA or SFA, or a mix of the two, believe it or not. So we've also been helping, for example, in air traffic control. It's just that the level of inefficiency of air traffic control across Europe is so huge that the regulators don't even know how to handle it. And so we still continue plodding along with like a 1%, 2% savings on an annual basis. But so these methods can help regulators, along with intuition, as Cathal said, to come up with something vaguely sensible.
Achim, would you? Yeah, you're muted.
Yes, I think when you're talking about benchmarking, then you're talking about sort of comparing airports or other firms and the efficiency entirely. But my understanding is that regulators, now we're talking about again linking regulation to benchmarking, but is using benchmarking, for instance, to determine the WACC, weighted average cost of capital, or beta values, which then sort of go into the regulatory formula for determining charges. So I think there are different ways in which benchmarking can affect such things as regulation or other policies. And that's just something I wanted to say. I think makes sense also, this because the topic of this webinar was, shall we use benchmarking? I think this kind of benchmarking seems to me very obviously making a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good. Now, Hans Martin, you're muted, but you would like to make a comment?
Comment to Darryl, or question to Darryl. Do I get you right that with benchmarking operating costs, you have less problems or fewer problems? I think if so, then that is already helpful. I think when you so that's at least part of regulation where you can then use benchmarking. And secondly, I think the problem is that the asymmetric information the regulator has, and I think then benchmarking, first of all, whatever you do, even Darryl, when you lay out the problem with the cost function, that already creates the map where you can then have a rational dialogue. Otherwise, you end up with something like with Cathal in the beginning. Everybody says something and it's all over the place. Yeah, so I think that's one advantage of benchmarking. And perhaps the third approach is, or the first issue is, with airports, benchmarking is not that much done. I had the pleasure of doing that for air traffic control because Nicole had provided, with two other colleagues, a report on ATC in Europe. And there it was extremely helpful because you cannot use it mechanically, but it gives you an estimate about the inefficiency gap. Is it 5% or 30%? And then it's a long, complicated regulatory process, but there's a lot of judgment in that. But I think it's useful to know whether it's just 5% or 30%. And it's good to know that more objectively than just from anecdotal evidence. Thank you.
Right.
So look, those are great comments again, Hans Martin. Your first point was, let's suppose that there are fewer problems with benchmarking operating expenditure. Isn't that a help? Well, no, not really, because if you might, well, simply because you can't set the revenue allowance for a regulated firm on the basis of the one which has the most efficient operating expenses, because to the extent there's any substitution between OPEX and CAPEX, then that won't give you the best outcome for consumers overall. As I mentioned earlier, I'm visiting Bali at the moment. Wage rates in Bali are less than Australia, maybe 1/10 of Australia. So the airport in Bali might have operating costs which are 1/10 of, say, the airports in Australia. That doesn't mean that they are any more efficient, or they probably have different labor capital substitution as well, and that would be appropriate. It would be appropriate for Australian airports to have more mechanization, and so I don't think it's easy or right. Is my video gone? Darn,
yes.
My video gone.
Yeah,
okay, I apologize for that. Hopefully it'll come back. The second point, you said that you said the difference between a 5%, and we could do the process that you could get a 5% or 30% efficiency gap. Sorry about the video. My question back in response to that was, how do we know? How do we know it's 5%, or how do we know it's 30%? All we know is that we've done the exercise and it's come up with a number. We don't have any way of knowing whether that corresponds to anything real on the ground. So that's the problem. We can do it. We can come up with numbers, but how do we put any it's an additional step to put weight on those numbers and say that we have something that is valuable upon which we can set revenues. I'll try to correct the video. Go ahead.
Good. So thanks, Darryl. We've got a couple of queries, one from Jürgen, and then on to David Starkey, and then I think we'll have to finish. But so, Jürgen, are you able to speak now?
Can we try to see if the microphone works now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Aha, okay. Sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Okay, so I think the point is essentially that benchmarking is a tool by itself for different objectives, and you want to know if it's for the regulator, for the customer, or for the companies, you see, and each one has a different objective. And I just want to give you a couple examples, because when you look at the objectives, then you also have different variables which we're going to use and look at different processes. You see, we looked at Norway, and they wanted to see how their airports were doing over time and compared to others. And that was a long time period. There was a lot of data, and this was very useful in an iterative way. In other words, we used the data which we could get. Some of them we didn't get, and then they looked at it, and we had some more discussions about this. Then we also talked to people in Toronto, you see, and Toronto does a two-step approach. They do benchmarking of Canadian airports, and then afterwards they sit together and say, look, these are the results. Why are you so good, or why are you so bad? What do we have to change in the variables in order to make it useful? So that is a relation for the operator. You see, he's trying to figure out how he can improve it. The question of the regulator is only one of the questions. So I think we have to see exactly what it is used for. And benchmarking can be used for very specific processes, for the whole airport, etc. And I think we should really give way to this tool, because it can be shown to be very useful.
Right. Good. Thank you. I might just pass on to David Starkey, and then we'll have to finish off. But David, would you like to have a quick response?
Yes, I share Darryl's skepticism, and also take on board the points that Cathal was making at the beginning. But I just would like to pose the question, is there possibility some mileage in disaggregating the functions in airports and benchmarking those specific functions? For example, is it possible we can meaningfully compare baggage handling efficiencies of airports, focused on baggage handling, or focusing on check-in facilities or other processes within the airports, focusing on a disaggregated function? Is it possible that that might be a way forward with benchmarking?
Thanks, David. In fact, I might
like
just pass on to Cathal, because I think he has some experience in doing that. Have you done some of, I think Cathal has done some work of that nature, haven't you?
So I'll just agree with a comment Hans Martin made earlier. I do think it has to do with disaggregation. If you're only looking at OPEX, for example, then I think the difficulties of capital cost estimation, which are certainly both of a different nature and a high challenge, can in fact be put to one side. The exercise must be, I think, somewhat simpler then, a little simpler anyway. It is true that there was a consultancy firm that was producing or seeking to produce core operating cost measures for airports, which at least partly isolated some elements of the cost base and seeking to do it on a more consistent basis. I don't think that's still being done, but it didn't resolve the problems really, because it simply presented a whole new set of challenges over what those particular adjustments were. And I guess it must have been taking underlying operating budgets from airports, which maybe you would have a fault with as well. One thing does occur to me. I mean, I recall hearing a presentation a good while ago for the water industry for Britain, where a very, very large exercise was conducted involving all the water firms and their accountants and the regulatory office and consultants. And they sought to produce a database that the participants were willing to accept, that as far as possible contained comparable information. Now, there were a good many person years consumed in that exercise, but perhaps in a less confrontational environment about airport regulation, some progress in that direction might be attempted as well, to maybe the variables people wouldn't agree on, but at least the underlying numbers might be shared in a consistent way. Although a lot of work is required. I mean, depreciation policies vary a lot and have a big bearing on things, but there are many other reasons why numbers are collected in a different fashion.
Thank you. I think we'd better finish off there now. So thanks to all of our panelists. And I think we've had a really good discussion. And thank you to everyone who's come along. And so next week, we'll be having Mike Brown, and he'll be talking about his new book on airport planning. So same time next week. So hope to see you all there then. Thank you.